Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today I'm welcoming Andrew Root to the show. Andrew is the Carrie Olson Baalson Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He writes and researches in areas of theology, ministry, culture, and younger generations. His recent books are Churches in the Crisis of Decline, When Church Stops Working, and what we will be talking about today, The Church After Innovation. Andy has worked in congregations, parachurch ministries, and social service programs. He lives in St. Paul with his wife, Carrie, 2 children, and their dog. When not reading, writing, or teaching, Andy spends far too much time watching TV and movies. And for our regular listeners, you may notice my voice is a little off today. I'm actually home dealing with COVID, so please forgive any voice struggles or mental lapses. But for then, let's welcome Andy to the show. All right, welcome to the show, Andy Root. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you that's not in your bio?
Oh, man, I don't know. I think it even says in my bio that I watch way too much TV, at least in one bio somewhere. So, I think maybe, I don't know.
What are you watching right now?
What I'm watching right now, well, we're watching The Last of Us on HBO.
Okay.
We're pretty into that.
Okay.
And we've been watching 1923 too on Paramount Plus, but I don't know. We're a little lukewarm on that, but
okay.
Yeah, so those are the main 2 things. But we're gonna start Your Honor soon on Showtime, I think. But
boy, all these streaming channels I unfortunately do not have. But I'm not into horror, so I would not do The Last of Us, irregardless. Yeah,
it is interesting. It's more than horror. I'd say it's just like dystopian, but it does have a horror element to it for sure.
Yeah, I don't. I want to sleep at night, so suspense is not my thing.
It is very suspenseful. My wife screams all the time, and it's actually quite annoying. But,
I think I just connected the dots here recently. Your wife is Carrie Root, who's a pastor.
Yeah, she goes by Cara.
Cara, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Yep, she's a pastor in South Minneapolis.
So you have kids, so I'm just kind of gonna envy and I guess shame myself about y'all have 2 very successful, apparently, jobs, doing the kid thing and apparently still functioning well. So maybe I can take some notes after this conversation, how you do that.
Well, I don't know if we're doing it well.
Okay.
I mean, we're stumbling through life, you know. I have an 18-year-old and both of them and a 15-year-old daughter, an 18-year-old son and a 15-year-old daughter, and they would probably tell you differently on
Fair enough.
how elegantly we're doing this. We're actually, like I said, stumbling and getting concussed along the way as we try our best.
Fair enough. Well, to share, if you would, kind of your journey of faith, what that looked like initially, what it looks like today.
Yeah, it's in some ways I'm a kind of classic Protestant, raised in the church kind of kid, and then in maybe other ways not so much. Like I don't come from a family of church professionals in any way. You know, like my dad wasn't a bishop, and as a matter of fact, my dad rarely went to church other than when there was snow on the ground in the Upper Midwest, because his real religion is golf, and but I got pulled into my church really young and, started being asked to be part of stuff. And it had a huge impact on me. But probably the biggest impact was when I was quite young, which has kept me pretty interested in the spiritual experience of children, is that when I was 4, tragically, the first friend I ever had got cancer. And I kind of watched him die as a 4-year-old, but then had really experiences with I guess today we would, call it experiences with trauma or whatever, but just really kind of deeply frightened by that experience, and was, kind of haunted by nightmares and things like that, but had a really profound experience of the presence of Jesus Christ at that age, of a God who kind of meets me in these places of despair and brokenness. And had this, I tell about it in one book of being 6 and moving into a new house, and it was in a new development, and falling into this dugout foundation for this house. My mom telling me never to go near that thing. And I really wasn't in any danger. It was just dusk and it was getting dark, but I was frightened.
Yeah.
And it really did represent like the abyss in the world, and in the kind of evil, or just the manifestations of darkness in the world that can come and take the life of a 4-year-old or 5-year-old. And I remember, being stuck in that hole and praying, and really feeling the presence of Jesus Christ come to me there, and feeling, the Spirit yell to me to run. And I ran myself out of that. And just like the women at the tomb, I ran into my house on a warm Minnesota summer night and testified to my mom that I prayed and Jesus had got me out of the hole. And that experience has never left me. I mean, the real concrete experience of Jesus Christ who comes and ministers life in the midst of death has been a real central dynamic to my life. That's started when I was, 4, 5, 6 years old, and it has stuck with me. And so, I often return to that. I mean, in some ways, to deconstruct my story would be like, oh, isn't that cute? Like
right.
If I wouldn't have come home in 15 minutes, and my parents would have found me there. So I was not in really any danger, but there was this real moment of crying out to God and having God meet me in a real way. So I think it's formed my life probably more than anything else. And and still, trying to day by day walk the journey of trying to give my life over to this God made known in Jesus Christ, and am really moved by continuing to try to think about this, and think about the practice of ministry as a really profound theological reality where a very living God meets us.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. What are some spiritual practices that are meaningful for you?
Yeah, I mean, like the cop-out answer to this is like my whole life is a spiritual practice. Because at least until I start watching TV. You could get me to justify actually that watching TV is a spiritual practice too, because it's research for all the writing I'm doing or whatever, which is really a cop-out. It's not. It's just pure entertainment and turning off my brain. But that's how I can justify all the streaming services you don't have that are on my credit card bill. I can justify them.
You can expense
research,
them.
Man. Yeah, right. It's a form of spiritual practice. So like reading and writing, I think is a spiritual practice. It's also an academic exercise. So I feel like I have to have other spiritual practices that fuel my life. But I'm kind of like, an early riser. I'm most productive in the morning, but I get up, I have a bowl of cereal, and then I spend about 25 minutes in silent prayer, and I pray with an icon that, I'm a good Protestant Lutheran kid with Reformed connections to an education, but there's some of the religious practices of the East that have gotten into my being. And so, an icon of Jesus, and trying to be silent in meditative prayer is important. And then, I read scripture every morning, and that's pretty central to me. I think prayer is a pretty formative for us, even as we think about kind of faith in a secular age. That teaching people to pray again, I think, is really important. And so I'm trying my best to live into that.
Teaching people to pray. I'm writing that down. Well, thanks so much for sharing those. So I was excited to have you on. Came across your work, talked to your publisher, got a couple copies of some of your books, and read recently The Church After Innovation. And I think I'm going to nerd out here a little bit. What I loved about the book first was, like, when I first started, I was like, well, am I reading an economics book here? Am I reading a theology book? Am I reading a history book? Because I feel like the first 4,500 pages was like some good, what's his name again? The demand side guy, help me out here. COVID brain. The
Keynesian.
Keynesian. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
some good debate about Keynesian, economic theory. Anyway,
Yeah.
let me get back to where we're supposed to be. So I really enjoyed the book for that matter. I recommend it for folks because it really takes a deep dive into what's the word you use, not the cultural milieu, but similarly depose it. What was the word?
Yeah. This it's a French word that I'm even embarrassed to try to pronounce, like dispositif or something like that. But yeah, just really the malaise of what it means even to live in a secular age, and yeah.
So I think I'm going to kind of start this a little simple, maybe, and try to dig deep here a little bit, and hopefully through my COVID brain makes sense to our listeners and to you. But I think the first quote that really, many quotes stuck out to me, so I had to narrow it down here. But the first one I want to run by you was just this quote about human beings needing ritual of dependability, order, constancy that lead to some security. Now, unlike you, I grew up independent fundamental Baptist, where it was kind of, we were allergic to anything that looked and smelled like ritual or liturgy or ritual, even though we wouldn't use those words back then. That's what, we had our own rituals and liturgies. But I imagine, like me, you'd probably agree, like culturally, we're really against this any kind of real ritualization. What do you think that's about?
Yeah, and especially in the context of this book, and thanks for the kind words about the book. And it's it is. I feel like in relation to my other books, it's a little bit of the old man get off my lawn book. Like it's taking something that people are really into right now across Protestantism on innovation and being like, well, what do we really mean here? And so it's a little bit of my party pooper book, probably, but hopefully it's informative. But yeah, hopefully it's informative, people. But this is a great quote to start with, because it's really a central one. Is that that human beings, I think, really do need forms of ritual and needs forms of what Charles Taylor calls strong evaluations. I mean, like kind of moral visions, and those moral visions are always perpetuated or ingrained with us in certain rituals and certain kind of liturgical forms, and whether we call those that ritual and liturgy or not. But one of the things I wanted to explore is how work itself, that people really need to be working in environments. I mean, this is a book that really tries to explore work and how work seems to be more advantageous to the human spirit when it provides dependability and when it provides something like ritualization, just in order to it. But mainly why we want rituals so bad is because we need dependability. It gives us what one social theorist calls ontological security. I mean, it makes us feel like we have a place in the world, that again, the dependability is so important. But one of the things that happens in this kind of new capitalist kind of perspective that we're in, and by new I mean like since the 1980s,
right,
that we've been living with, and thanks for mentioning economic theory and stuff. I feel incredibly insecure about it. Like I know enough about economic theory to get by here. It's not, I'm not an economist in any way, but the shape of work obviously has something to do with the economy. And when we get into this new neoliberal kind of economic reality, you have to allow for a lot of flexibility. Like companies have to be constantly flexible, and they have to get to a place, which I find really quite fascinating, to a place of permanent innovation. And permanent innovation is the only way to make sure that in this kind of Darwinian competition for profits, that you don't end up, bleeding out, in a big corporation. Like we saw this in the 1980s. Like even IBM could get punched pretty hard in the gut by by a company like Apple, who's being run out of someone's garage in Silicon Valley. Like it became a very different world. So you needed a whole workforce that would be flexible, a whole workforce that would choose permanent innovation. And that meant living with a lot of just dependability not being there. And so there had to be a way to secure that. And I think the way kind of creativity and rhetorics of innovation and entrepreneurship become a way of managing people or offering people something else in place of the kind of dependability and ritual that we often need. And, the big push I'm trying to make in this book is what that reworks our view of the self, and that the self has to become this kind of creative juggernaut. The self has to always be its own little business, and that's the kind of workers we need, and that's the way we kind of feel like we need to live, even beyond work. That we're always kind of in a competition. That our daily lives are either taking W's or taking L's.
Mm-hmm.
Like you hear young people use that kind of language all the time. That it's an all competition at all times. So that's where I was going with that kind of sense of dependability, and how now what becomes dependable at work is trying to be creative,
right,
and be expressivist in a kind of individualistic way.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I'm not an economist either. I have an MBA, so some measure of business training, and I was like, man, this is spot on from my perspective, at least your kind of analysis and critique. But again, fanboying here. Speaking of, you mentioned like this need or expectation to be competitive, always expressive. I think that plays into the next question I was going to ask you here about the innovation and the move, or the challenge of innovation in churches is this inherent expectation that pastors kind of transition from being, a liturgical leader to like an innovator to managing change. And I think you point this out in the book, and that's certainly, I think this is a real challenge with this kind of obsession of innovation, which again, kind of confessing here, this is a lot of what I talk about in the podcast, but the real challenge of it is it's asking pastors to do something they didn't necessarily go into ministry for, weren't trained for in seminary. Is that fair?
I think that's really fair. And I also, like, I don't want the book to be an anti-innovation book. It isn't that in any way, but I do want us to say, well, why does it feel like everyone's attracted to this? Like what goods are inherent in it? And, so we can use innovation, let's be aware of where it comes from, and maybe some of its dark sides that may be there. So I do think what's happened that's really quite fascinating is that Protestantism in general, I think you can say, has always from its beginning, at least it's like Reformed 17th century kind of beginnings, has been really concerned about work. Like if Max Weber is right, it is Reformed Dutch Calvinism that creates the conditions for capitalism, so there's always been something about belief inherent within the capitalist system. But what's been fascinating is that Protestantism kind of spilled out its larger theological perspectives, spilled out into the work world and changed what it meant to work. And this happened across Western society. Like, for instance, hard work became a good.
Right.
In the medieval period, no one thought it was good to work hard. Like no one was aiming for that, but almost every middle-class parent now just wants their kids to learn how to work hard.
Right.
Or you just have to watch a little bit of TV and you hear people, this is part of our sports culture too, just glorifying people who are on
blue
the
collar,
who are working hard.
That's the thing right now in sports, blue collar. Teams.
Yep, and you're out there. And even as people who are kind of, you hear this on Shark Tank too. Like, people are always on the hustle. You got to be on the hustle. You got to be on the hustle. You got to be on the hustle. And that would have just not been something anyone could imagine without the impact of Protestantism. But what I find fascinating and try to explore in this book is that we've had this kind of reverse, where Protestantism kind of washed out its forms, washed out into the work world and shaped what qualified as good work. But now we've seen an almost reverse flow, where the form of work, how we're working, has flowed back into the practice of ministry. And now for pastors, what qualifies as good ministry is a certain form of late capitalist work, which is to be a constant innovator. And I don't think people are trained for this in many ways. And I am a little skeptical, that even the core of ministry should be about being innovative, not because innovation is bad, but because I think it's usually born out of the desire to be innovative is born out of the fear of decline. And I just am not so sure that the fear of decline is going to ever, there's not the impetus that we have to solve the issue of decline. I don't think is going to ever get us to a faithful place, in the context of just the church and particularly ministry. And so I think some people are really trying to push innovation as a kind of faithful way of being, but I think they haven't thought enough about the kind of inherent theological anthropologies that are set in there. And I think denominations and others really want their pastors to be innovative, because innovation at one level is getting more out of less.
Right.
And if there's any context where there's less, it's
church.
It's pastors and churches, so be an innovative pastor, because then you can win more resources out of less. And I don't know, I feel like the gospel is calling us to something deeper than that.
There's so much questions I want to ask you based on that question, but a lot more, so much stuff here to work through. Let me ask you this. I don't know if you use this word in just what you said, but certainly in your book, you talk about the creativity and the drive for singularity being, I think, a key word, a key theme in the book. And I think you use the word cancerous, and which again, strong language. But I thought about this, and tell me if you disagree. I thought about, like, even in my own last 10, 15 years of church experience, through my own deconstruction, reconstructing, seeing other people kind of deconstruct and sort of like deconstruct their way out of church. Like, I found self-expression, and I don't need church anymore. And I was curious if this kind of gets at what you're trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, it actually really does. And, I don't quite deal with this. Well, I mean, I think I have some kind of points that could lead a reader down that way in the book. But I do see that. Like, I think you find this on whatever social media platform you're on. But, the one I'm on, which is probably the most dumpster fire of all of them, Twitter, is that you can see people performing there's just a drive to always be performing the self,
right?
Showing yourself as this creative, singularly unique person that other people should be following, giving an attention to.
Yeah.
And I do think for people who grew up in more conservative Protestant contexts, there becomes a kind of strategy or a kind of performative shape that this kind of refusing everything you've grown up with becomes a way for you to kind of exercise your singularity. Now, there may be some good reasons to deconstruct, but I do think we have to be very aware of how this whole system that we're in, and this whole kind of late capitalist system we're in, just really encourages us to be performative selves, and to see congregations, to see people, to see, my gosh, the coffee shop in your area, that what gives them ultimate value is their ability to reach towards singularity, to being uniquely singular. And to think about singularity means that there's a fundamental competitive reality here. And in many ways, you've heard people say this about Twitter or Instagram or something, that like my Instagram game isn't very good.
Right.
And that does unveil, that does reveal that it's a game. Like, there's a game at play here. Winning attention, winning eyeballs, winning more follows, winning more retweets is a game. And I just think that this has become something that's really central to the way our economy functions, but then the way we function as individuals, and it just shapes us in a way that I want to question.
Yeah, and I heard this in another podcast I was listening to. A guest was making the point that the kind of the spiritual but not religious, I imagine gets at your same point here, that the onus is on the individual to keep kind of maintaining their own kind of religious formation. I mean, I know it's kind of contradictory, but I think, and again, that seems like it can take one saying, I don't need church because I'm formed beyond church. And if I'm understanding your book correctly, you're saying that church is an essential aspect of one's spiritual formation, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think your ability to, I think you have to, as a Christian expression, you have to be in community, because I think, I think one of the moves that I'm trying to make theologically at this end of this book, and particularly returning to these mystics of the Rhineland, these 12th, 13th century mystics, is that there's a need to make a confession and to confess that what you need for salvation, or what you just need for a sense of fullness in your life, is not within you, that it's outside of you.
Yeah.
And Christian community is essential because it reminds you again and again that you have to give yourself over to something that is outside of you. And that starts with another community of people that hear your confession and care for you, and that we all need others to minister to us and care for us. And I do think that some of the moves, I think spirituality plays a very interesting role in our cultural context, but I think it does become absolutely do it yourself. but it also becomes really necessary because you're in constant competition, and that constant competition of performance of the self is incredibly chafing. And one of the ways to deal with the chafing, and to be more specific, like the anxiety and the burnout of this, is you're going to need some spirituality. Like the spirituality becomes a way of coping with the hyper competition that you have around every turn. That spirituality becomes a way of exercising your authenticity, and even you can use it as a kind of way of broadcasting, or at least kind of helping you engender your own singular creativity. So yeah, I mean, you can see, like, as a post 60s into a neoliberal age in the 80s, how there becomes all this arrival of New Age spirituality in other forms, where spirituality or a spiritual life gets disconnected from organized religion, because organized religion isn't singular. It doesn't seem very creative. My gosh, you're always turning backwards to a tradition.
Right.
You have to submit yourself to a community of people.
Right.
It's not a lot of value added maybe towards this race of presenting yourself as a singularly unique performative self.
Yeah.
But I think that becomes part of the huge problem here.
So I like what you said about, when I read this section in the book, my mind went to soteriology, and we probably don't have time to dive in as much as there is here. I'm thinking there is here, but correct me if I'm wrong. This is like a can't say the word here. COVID brain. Soteriological question here is, so I thought that was fascinating. Where does salvation come from, essentially, right, is what you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, in multiple ways too. I mean, at one way, I'm asking that question just broadly, culturally, like every human being. I mean, we're kind of back to human beings needing rituals,
right.
Human beings needing kind of moral frameworks, that every human being has to live with some sense of something saving them. Like something will make their life full, something will give them connection to a good life. But I do, to echo your point, really do mean it in a theological way too. And there is, like, if people want to kind of read this, there is a kind of, even the mystical writers that I work with in the last chapters are ones who inspired Luther. So there is a deep sense that what it means to be a Christian, or the shape of the Christian life, is a stopping and a receiving. It's a confessing that you don't have what you need to find salvation, and it's to receive the gift, the free gift of the person of Jesus Christ. But it does demand something of you, which it demands that you confess that you are one who is in want, that you don't have this creative way within yourself to save yourself, that you do have to submit to something outside you to save you. And so, even a mystic like Meister Eckhart has this deep sense of we find God in nothingness, and we find God at the ground, when we get to the ground of our being, that when we realize that all of our own performative acts cannot get us anywhere. And Luther really doubles down on that. That's where we find this incredible promise, an incredible encounter with a God who saves us in the midst of our impossibility.
I think this is what fascinated me about this part of your book, and push back here if you disagree, but I sort of feel like I'm fully within this theological framework, but that kind of progressive Christianity is kind of presents this case that you're arguing against, is essentially that human beings are good, we're just a little bit roughed up around the edges, we're inherently good, we don't really need that much help, we just need to be kind of patted on the head and told God loves us. Now again, I grew up in the very conservative framework that I was awful, rotten scoundrel of a human being, desperately in need of a savior. Am I caricaturing liberal progressive Christianity too much there?
No, and I think it's everywhere in our cultural context. I mean, I really agree with you. I'm not one who wants to kind of race into those kind of fundamentalist, heavy-handed categories. I think those have been quite honestly, if they've been exposed as abusive, and I think they are abusive, but I'm not so sure that the best response is to kind of go to a more what we would kind of call an genealogical or philosophical vein, like a more Rousseauian perspective that goes back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which basically flipped Augustine on his head and said, there's nothing sinful inside of you. When humanity, you're perfect naturally, just the way you are.
Yeah.
If anything corrupts you, it's that the larger society corrupts you. So to put that in parlance of today, it's like and this is how my kids, the school, the very progressive school that my kids go to, they're essentially, deeply believe in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's anthropology, which is you're perfect just the way you are. And the only thing that's a problem for you is all the haters out there.
Right.
There's like bullies and haters who don't recognize you in this unique, creative way that you are. And again, there's something that you can only get to that perspective of the kind of uniqueness and the beauty of the human being through the Christian tradition, I think. At least I think a lot of that comes through Christianity, but there's a certain way that it gets flipped. And now the source of your salvation is yourself and your self's own performance, not that there's something outside of you. And the first move is to confess that you need that there's something amiss and that you need some saving from outside of you. And I could, I'm sure some of your listeners, people are falling off the treadmill right now or something, or as they're getting milk or something, or, what? But there's certain ways that having a very high anthropology, which you're perfect just the way you are, you're unique, you're creative, you're amazing. You just can't listen to those haters out there in society. That we're seeing empirically right now that kind of anthropology, if you go with me, we have to prove a correlation here, but it creates incredible amounts of anxiety.
And I don't need anybody, right?
Depression.
Because people outside of me are the problem. So I don't need other people. I just need me.
Absolutely. It gets to that. And then we have a generation, then that lives through a pandemic and essentially goes that way.
Yeah. And
it becomes incredibly isolated because, why would you even risk getting to know somebody who's maybe will misrepresent you, or you tacitly know you're competing against them anyhow. So what happens when you just don't have enough energy for that? Like that becomes it leads to a certain deep kind of level of despondency.
Well, this is really interesting. Let me get back a little bit on track here. Thanks for taking that side road with me. Continuing back onto innovation, and I think this theme, or something I was going to ask you about too. Actually, I can't resist here. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Josh Packard and I forget the guy's first name, Ferguson. Having them on soon, authors of the book Stuck. One of the things they talk about is, I think they use the term futurism, which they talk about this kind of temptation or ideology to kind of just throw out everything from the past, and basically saying that you need these kind of systems and routines and institutions to build something for the future. And I'll just say, as someone who's done New Church, as someone who's done social entrepreneurship, there's this kind of message just go build it all from scratch. And I'll just say, from my perspective, it's basically impossible to build anything from scratch. Does this kind of fit in line with your kind of innovation?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Yeah. I in the book, I try to use these, whether well or not, try to use these kind of characters that I have, so, and these are people I've run into out in the church.
Yeah,
and,
I just don't want to stay away from being a caricature in your next book.
It is a problem. I think, my wife has told me no one's going to ever talk to you again, because they'll just end up being, given a funny name. I use, I was raised on Seinfeld, so, all the kind of nicknames for people, just come out. But, I've met so many of these young pastors, which I think I call Applebee's boy here in this book, who are just so much just the past is the enemy. And the only reason they even want to be a pastor is because of what they can create tomorrow. And if you told them they had to do that kind of Men in Black kind of thing where you forget everything that's ever happened, they'd be all for it. And I feel like they're quite naive, to be honest. But then I've met these others who are all, towards the end of their careers, who in this book I call Bearded Brown Turtleneck, because they tend to be older men who have been, a pastor for 30 years, and the color of their beard matches the color of their turtleneck, and they hate this. They hate the idea that Protestant denominations are trying to change. They feel like everything went wrong back in 1963 when they stopped saying these kind of words of institution over the Eucharist. And they just want to return. They just want to find a time machine and go back. And I'm not so sure that I want to follow those guys either. I'm not so sure that that's the best way. So there is a sense here where I am trying to do some retrieval, and there is a lot of kind of historical work here, but it is a kind of retrieval that's trying to give us a vision for what it might mean to be faithful today. But I don't think it's healthy to fetishize the past. And I also don't think it's healthy to just, fetishize the future and forget that there was a past. I think there has to be a balance at play here. And as Protestants, we're not very good at it, whether conservative or mainline liberal, we're not very good at holding that tension, but I think it's more than ever a necessity.
Let me ask you two more questions if I can before we take a break. One quote you have is that innovation runs the danger of, and I'm paraphrasing here, making the church the star of its own story. Tell me more about that quote. I was kind of curious what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's in this book does build on a book called Churches in the Crisis of Decline, where I really try to develop that theologically. And my larger kind of theological biblical point is that the church has an incredibly important part to play in salvation history and in God's working in the world. But really the star of the church's story is God and God's ministry to the world, God's bringing salvation to the world. And that the church's role is to narrate that story. The church's role is to be a supporting part of the supporting cast in that. But almost what happens inside of the fear of decline, and almost every consultant tells pastors and denominations this, is that your congregation has to find its uniqueness. You have to find your singularity because it's the only way you're going to compete. And so there becomes this obsession that you are the most important thing. Your church is the most important. Their church's story is the most important thing. And yet theologically, that's just not the case. What gives the church life is remembering again and again that it is seeking for the encounter with a God who is God. And that this God's story, who is breaking into the world and bringing salvation to this world, that's the main story. And of course, the church has an incredibly important part to play in that, but not as taking the spotlight away from God, surely, and really not as taking the spotlight away from the world that God is bringing salvation to. The church is to be a servant. The church is to be the narrator. If we think about this as a movie or something, it's supposed to be, or a novel, it's supposed to be the narrator here.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be in a supporting role. And I do think there's a deep temptation in the shadows of decline to make the church obsessed with the church.
Yeah.
And I think the church only has a life when it gets out of its own way. And you can look at this in all reform movements, that really what energizes reform movements is not when they're talking about how to reform the church. The best reform movements are always talking about God. What is God doing? Who is this God? How do we encounter this God? And that will have the effect of changing the church. But the focus, no one goes into a really historically into a reform movement thinking, let's redo the church. Let's make it more relevant. You go in thinking like, how do we help sinful people hear the word of God again? How do we help people who are, in deep forms of oppression, find hear the word of God that brings life to them? Like, those are the kind of, I think, important kind of conversations that we have to have. And I think too often, at least sometimes with my own students, it's like, I need to change the church.
Yeah.
I need to change the church, instead of like, how do you discern the call of this living God, and that will have the effect of changing the church, no doubt about it. But your focus isn't on changing the church; your focus is on hearing again the speaking and call of the living God.
So let me ask one more question here before we take a break. Perhaps this is the thing that stuck out to me most here at the end of the book. You write, and again, I'm paraphrasing, the church doesn't need more innovators, it needs more ministers. For what will save the church is an encounter with a living God, what you're talking about just now. And again, this is kind of a hot take-ish here, so Andrew, if you don't like this, push back against me. I wondered, is the problem in many mainline progressive churches we don't believe this, that we need an encounter with the living God?
Yes. I would nuance it just a tad bit.
Okay.
I think as a theoretical idea, there are a few that would say, no, we don't need that. But we, being shaped as people who are seeking to put ourselves in a place of encountering this living God. Yeah, I think we either become distracted or we're not even so sure deeply intellectual people could believe this. I mean, this is the whole series is kind of, rests on Charles Taylor's work. And I think this is kind of Taylor's point, is not everywhere in our Western cultural context, but it becomes very easy in this cultural context to think or to not think about God at all, even for pastors,
right?
To go like 3 weeks, to go a month and just really not think about God. You can go through the motions of writing your sermon,
right?
And, doing pastoral care maybe, but have you really thought about God? Not really. You become kind of a religious professional that's trying to give the religious goods to people. But what does it really mean to be encountered by a living God, to be encountered by the resurrected Jesus Christ? I do think that that's hard. And I think there's a lot of mainline pastors I know who aren't so sure they want to think about that, aren't so sure how to think about that. I think we do become, I don't want to say that the whole innovation obsession becomes a distraction from that, but I do think it potentially runs the risk of that.
All right, let's take a quick break. All right, we're back with Dr. Andrew Root. Andy, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation. Really encourage folks to check out what's your newest book here. Is it Churches in the Crisis of Decline, or When Church Stops Working? Yeah,
that's coming out in May, When the Church Stops Working, which is a kind of a layperson version of this Ministry in the Secular Age series that I've been working on. So, the idea is hopefully that staffs and councils of lay people and pastors can work through some of these ideas.
Well, if you want to really nerd out, I recommend the whole thick series, but I'm sure the compilation will be helpful for sure there too. Let's roll through these closing questions here. Tell me, I'm curious to hear your answer here. If you're Pope for a day, anything you want to accomplish?
Well, if I was Pope for a day, the first thing I would do is go to the Sistine Chapel without any lines, like before it opens and things like that. I'd also get just some really good Italian food if I was Pope for a day. But if I was Pope for a day, more directly, truly, if Protestantism had a Pope, I guess, if that wasn't just counterintuitive to the whole thing, it would be kind of getting back to wrestling with these big questions of the presence of God. And it would be really trying to release people from the anxiety of decline and try to turn us towards something deeper than just trying to win more resources so we can feel less vulnerable.
What's a theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Well, the good news is that hopefully they're all coming back to life and with the rest of us in the resurrection. But for me, I would have to say, I mean, anyone who knows me is going to know this is my answer. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer has been just such a central person to my imagination and to all of my theological development for 20 years. So probably Bonhoeffer first. Though I kind of would like to meet St. Nicholas Because, at the Council of Nicaea, he punches Arius in the face. So I'm not sure if I would really want to hang out with Nicholas too much, because I would be afraid I'd get, punched. But it'd be kind of interesting to see that, to just see his personality. So maybe someone like that too.
What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
That is a great question. I don't know. I mean, it's so hard to know inside of it. It feels like to me that, it feels like we're at a hinge point. Like either history will look back at us and think this was a really weird time. Like the first three decades of the 21st century were very odd times as people were trying to rework stuff, and then they found some stable ground. Or maybe not. Maybe we just kind of keep going down this road and people look back on it and think like, this is where we became, they probably wouldn't use the word enlightened, but this is where we got back, like we finally beat all the enemies we had to, and we got back to the right place. I don't know. I do think when we look back in a church history way, we're going to realize that these times were not good times for the church. However, we're also, and I think we should remember this now, these are not the worst times that the church has ever had. And I think we sometimes catastrophize, if we don't do something now, if we don't get our junk together now, the church is going to disappear in a decade. Well, first of all, that is a huge theological statement to make, that the very body of Christ could disappear. And it gives way more power to the human agents than to our trust in the divine reality. But there have been just, objectively more difficult times for the church in its 2,000 years than this one. We are not in the golden era for sure, but there have been more difficult times. Like, just go to Northumbria, and there were 300 years where they had to abandon churches because there were Viking raiders coming. And, our churches are fragile. Our denominations are fragile, but at least we don't have Viking raiders knocking down the doors and stealing all our gold or something, So I think they'll remember these as definitely not the golden years of the church, but also not the worst years ever either.
What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
Yeah, my hopes for the future of Christianity are really high, because my hopes in the gospel and my hopes in the work of God are very high. But what I hope is that we remember that first and foremost, this God that we seek is a God who ministers life to death and brings life out of death. And I hope that we remember that the practice of ministry, whether done by, clergy or done by lay people or any of us, is a profound reality. That it is, as we care for one another and when we minister to one another, that we participate in the very being of God by sharing in the action of God. And that is a incredibly beautiful and profound thing. And I hope we remember that. And I hope we remember that the relationships we have within our world and within our church aren't just for instrumental purposes, that just embracing one another and being with and for one another as a witness to a God who's with and for us in Jesus Christ has a sacramental reality. Like there's a way that God is present in the midst of that. And I think we need to embrace that. And that is my concern, that too much of this innovation, singularity talk in every relationship, too much of this performing self in every relationship is instrumentalized for gain instead of embrace and gift.
Well, I really have enjoyed this conversation. Really want to recommend the book and your broader work. Tell folks where they can find your books, get connected with you, those kind of things.
Yeah, well, the best way to find the books is, whether you like it or not, is on Amazon.
Okay, I always try not to give Amazon pub, and people just go right towards it.
I know, it's so easy, and we're all in Jeffrey Bezos. Jeffrey Bezos is in our pocket. So, you can find things on my website, which is andrewroot.org, and you can find me there. You can email me if you need to, and you can find me talking with my friend Derek on my podcast called When Church Stops Working, which is reflecting that book that's coming out. But yeah, those are some places to find me.
Awesome. Well, one of my rituals is to always leave people with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romick-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.